The North African desert was not merely a battlefield. It was a crucible of shattered illusions. For seasoned German soldiers, the sands of Tunisia were the starkest evidence that the military machine they had trusted was faltering. Headman Radka, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, and Feldkurt Zimmerman, a young officer whose faith in the Reich had never wavered, watched as entire divisions crumbled under the relentless pressure of Allied offensives. By May 1943, the campaign reached its inexorable conclusion. The surrender of roughly 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops, what was supposed to be a demonstration of German efficiency and strategic superiority, had instead become an unmitigated disaster. And yet, for those like Radka and Zimmerman, defeat was only the first shock. Their next confrontation with reality awaited not on the battlefield but behind barbed wire. Once rounded up, prisoners were transported to makeshift POW camps in Algeria, such as the Overy camp, a sprawling compound run with precision by American and Allied officers. The German soldiers, steeped in propaganda that painted their enemies as decadent, inefficient, and morally corrupt, were immediately confronted with the first sign of cognitive dissonance: humane treatment. The prisoners were issued adequate clothing, provided hot meals with variety unimaginable in the ration-deprived Afrika Korps, and processed in a system that moved swiftly yet methodically. Officers recorded medical data, assigned quarters, and ensured sanitation standards that were meticulously enforced. For soldiers who had been taught to expect cruelty or contempt from inferior enemies, the experience was bewildering. Hunger, fatigue, and despair were replaced by a peculiar kind of confusion. Radka, in his diary, would later write, "I expected contempt, but they greeted us with order and efficiency. It did not feel like a prison." Yet the real transformation lay beneath this surface of courtesy. Each American officer, every orderly procedure, every predictable supply of food was a subtle but relentless assertion. The Reich's vision of the world was incomplete. Soldiers began whispering among themselves, questioning what they had been told. Some laughed it off nervously, attributing the treatment to chance or diplomacy. But others, particularly younger troops like Zimmerman, felt an unfamiliar, gnawing unease. And then, rumors began circulating among the men, stories of massive factories, ships, and planes being built with an efficiency that no German mind could have conceived. How could a nation so weak achieve such feats? By the fourth day, small groups of prisoners were allowed supervised excursions to nearby processing facilities. They observed warehouses stacked with crates of food, clothing, and military supplies, logistics operating at a scale that dwarfed anything they had seen in Europe. Radka noted in his journal that the sight made his stomach turn with envy and disbelief. The propaganda that had fortified his loyalty to Hitler was crumbling, not with a gunshot, but with a loaf of bread, a pair of shoes, and a regimented system of order. And yet, the most profound realization was still to come, as rumors spread of an even greater spectacle awaiting them across the Atlantic. The prisoners' evenings were quiet, spent in reflection or writing letters home. It was in these moments, under the desert stars, that doubts began to crystallize. Zimmerman wrote to a friend, "I do not know if I am a fool for thinking Germany invincible, or if they are fools for letting the world move without them." The juxtaposition of their defeat in Tunisia and the meticulousness of their captors began to seed a psychological vulnerability, one that would grow exponentially as the soldiers were moved to the next phase of their journey. American military officials, aware of the psychological power of this treatment, maintained strict standards. They knew that every well-fed prisoner, every orderly barracks, and every smoothly run medical inspection was undermining the propaganda that had trained these men to fear and hate the United States. For the first time, German soldiers encountered a paradox. Defeat had humbled them, but exposure to the enemy's competence and abundance would erode their ideological convictions entirely. And as night fell over the Overy camp, the soldiers could not yet grasp the full magnitude of what lay ahead, a journey that would forever change their understanding of power, technology, and society. It is at this moment, as the first Liberty ships were being prepared thousands of miles away, that the prisoners' world began to pivot. They did not yet know that crossing the Atlantic would confront them with a scale of industrial might so overwhelming that it would eclipse every battlefield victory or propaganda claim they had ever known. Each man wrestled with disbelief, shame, and curiosity, a psychological cocktail that would intensify with each passing hour. The desert winds carried whispers of unimaginable factories, efficient ports, and cities alive with electricity and motion. For Radka, Zimmerman, and thousands of others. The war they had thought they understood was about to be reframed in ways no doctrine or drill could have prepared them for. Before we move further, I want to ask you if you are enjoying this journey into history. Please click the subscribe button and like the video, as it helps more people see these incredible stories and ensures that this exploration of human experience and historical truth reaches a wider audience. The journey across the Atlantic was supposed to be a simple transit, a move from one point to another, but for the German prisoners aboard the Liberty ships, it became a slow, inescapable confrontation with a reality that no propaganda could have prepared them for. The SS Robert E. Peary, a vessel emblematic of American industrial genius, waited to transport hundreds of men from North Africa to the United States. What the soldiers would encounter aboard would challenge every expectation instilled in them since youth, slowly dismantling the ideological fortress that had protected them from doubt. As the post boarded the vessel, they could not help but notice the sheer size and efficiency of the shipyard that had produced it. Liberty ships were being built at unprecedented speed. 2,710 ships produced during the war, one in just over 4 days in some cases. The assembly lines were a marvel to behold, an industrial ballet that the soldiers could scarcely comprehend. Radka, peering through a porthole, wrote in his diary, "I have seen nothing like this. A ship born in days, moving as if by magic. How can a nation accomplish so much so fast?" He shuddered, a mixture of awe and fear gnawing at him. Inside, the vessel offered comforts that were almost surreal to the weary soldiers. Meals were plentiful, well-cooked, and nutritionally balanced. Crew members treated the prisoners with a measured politeness, correcting minor misunderstandings without anger. For men who had been conditioned to expect brutal treatment from enemies, even captured Germans, this was the rigidity of order and attention to detail on every deck, from sleeping quarters to the engine room, planted seeds of cognitive dissonance. How could such a powerful, orderly, and abundant society exist when their own homeland claimed it was weak and decadent? By the 4th day, some prisoners began to talk more openly about what they were seeing. The conversations were initially cautious, whispers in dimly lit corners of the ship. One recurring theme was the sense of scale and abundance. Supplies seemed limitless, machinery precise, and crew members competent and confident. Zimmerman, once fiercely loyal to Nazi ideals, was increasingly drawn into these discussions. He began noting discrepancies between what he had been taught and the evidence before him. How could a nation supposedly teetering on the brink of moral and economic collapse field such organized production? At night, Radka stared at the stars from the deck, feeling the enormity of the ocean and the journey ahead. It was here that some soldiers first contemplated a terrifying thought. The war might not be about tactics and bravery alone. It might be about the industrial, social, and technological resources backing each side. If the Americans could build ships faster than entire German divisions could be mobilized, what chance did the Reich truly have? Yet the full weight of this realization had not yet settled, lurking like a shadow in the back of their minds, waiting for the next confrontation. The crossing also revealed other aspects of American ingenuity. Radar, ship, engineering, and navigational technology left the prisoners astounded. Officers demonstrated instruments that could detect ships and aircraft far beyond German capabilities. Conversations with crew members hinted at a national infrastructure so vast that it dwarfed the European theaters of war. Radka noted, "Even the instruments speak of a power we do not understand. Everything is larger, faster, more precise." The seeds of doubt continued to grow, taking root in minds once impervious to contradiction. As the Liberty ship carved through the Atlantic waves, the prisoners began to see the limits of their former worldview. The Reich's propaganda had painted the Allies as decadent, inefficient, and morally corrupt, but, aboard the ship, the evidence was undeniable. The Americans were capable of coordinating resources, personnel, and technology on a scale they had never imagined. Private conversation turned into quiet debate. Some officers tried to reassure themselves, claiming, "This is only a single ship, a single experience. It does not prove the nation's superiority." But even the most resolute minds could not ignore the growing cognitive chasm. Even more striking were the glimpses of logistics on the ship. Tons of food, weapons, and machinery were moved with precision. Maintenance crews worked efficiently, systems rarely faltering. The prisoners began to whisper about the numbers. How could a nation that built a single ship in 4 days sustain such a level of output across an entire fleet? Each new fact piled upon the last, creating an almost unbearable tension, one that foreshadowed the greater revelations awaiting them on American soil. Then came the first hint of the societal contrasts that would further destabilize their assumptions. Sailors described towns and cities along the East Coast, lights visible even from the ship at night, infrastructure expanding far beyond what German newspapers had portrayed. "People live like kings in the streets, we will see," one officer warned, almost laughing at the irony. The prisoners, exhausted yet alert, realized that their journey was not only physical but psychological. What they had thought was a mere relocation was becoming a crash course in the magnitude of American capability. By the time the Liberty ship approached the American coastline, the prisoners were already in a state of heightened awareness. Their military training, their pride, even their ideological certainty, all were being quietly interrogated by exposure to competence, abundance, and modernity. The next stage promised even greater revelations. The arrival at Norfolk Naval Base and the journey across an entire continent would confront them with an industrial and social scale utterly beyond comprehension. They could not yet imagine the factory floors, the assembly lines, or the towns alive with electricity and industry awaiting them. As the ship neared port, conversations shifted to anxious speculation. Rumors of enormous docks, massive cranes, and sprawling warehouses had reached the prisoners even before they set foot on land. Every officer and enlisted man wondered, would their assumptions survive what they were about to witness? And what of the Americans themselves? How could a nation so wealthy and organized be brought to its knees, if at all? The Atlantic crossing was no longer just a passage. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of the German psyche. When the German prisoners finally stepped onto American soil at Norfolk Naval Base, the world they had known seemed to evaporate. The sprawling port extended over 4,300 acres, crisscrossed with tracks, cranes, and warehouses, each humming with purpose. Soldiers who had faced the deserts of North Africa, the chaos of retreat, and the calculated brutality of the Eastern Front found themselves in a land of order, abundance, and power that defied comprehension. Every inch of the port seemed designed to impress, overwhelm, and subtly humiliate. The efficiency and scale of the operation screamed the truth their homeland had refused to acknowledge. Zimmerman, notebook in hand, observed the unloading of cargo with mounting disbelief. Cranes lifted tons of equipment effortlessly. Containers were sorted and dispatched with mechanical precision, and workers moved with a sense of rhythm that made the German soldiers' best-trained units seem clumsy. Radka whispered to him, "This is no ordinary port. It is a city, an army, and a machine, all at once." They began to grasp that they were witnessing the backbone of a war effort beyond anything they had imagined. How could Germany ever hope to match this level of industrial sophistication when their soldiers were barely prepared to fight on equal terms? Their rail journey across the United States amplified this sense of dislocation. Pullman coaches, complete with sleeping berths, dining cars, and air conditioning, carried the prisoners through landscapes dotted with electric-lit towns and factories operating around the clock. Everywhere they looked, machinery roared, smokestacks towered, and production never ceased. Ordinary Americans, whether factory workers or service personnel, possessed a standard of living, comfort, and mobility that German soldiers had been conditioned to believe impossible. Radka and Zimmerman exchanged glances of disbelief. Private automobiles cruising through streets, children attending well-kept schools, and families living with conveniences that even officers in Germany would envy. It was during a stop in Pittsburgh that the first profound realization took hold. From the train, the soldiers saw the Alcoa aluminum plant, consuming 175,000 kilowatts of energy, producing metal essential for planes and ships. Workers moved with seamless coordination, raw materials transformed into critical components at dizzying speed. One German non-commissioned officer whispered, "I have never seen anything like this. This is not a nation at war. This is a nation unstoppable." The murmurs among the prisoners began to grow, an unspoken acknowledgement that their understanding of power, efficiency, and industrial capacity had been fundamentally affected. By the fourth day of their journey, the prisoners began to internalize a dangerous truth. The Americans were not just a military opponent, but a social and technological phenomenon. Factories ran multiple shifts, towns were fully electrified, and supply chains operated with breathtaking regularity. Zimmerman wrote, almost incredulously, in his diary. "We believed our propaganda, yet here, everything contradicts it. Food, light, machines, people. It is as if the Reich never existed." And as night fell over the train, the prisoners speculated quietly among themselves, could the very foundation of German pride survive exposure to such a world? The contrast was starkest in cities like Detroit, where soldiers were allowed glimpses of civilian life. Private vehicles lined the streets, shops stocked goods they had only heard about, and citizens moved with a confidence born of abundance. Letters sent back home reflected a mixture of envy, shame, and dawning respect. Radka described it as a moral earthquake, one that shook the pillars of his faith and the propaganda that had once guided his every thought. The Reich had promised that Americans were weak, divided, and decadent boot. Here, they saw unity, capability, and wealth. On a scale they could hardly fathom, the prisoners also began to notice the human dimension of efficiency. Factory workers laughed, joked, and took pride in their output. Children cycled to school alongside electric streetcars. Families prepared meals with appliances and conveniences that were unheard of in Germany. Even ordinary citizens seemed to operate as if the entire nation were a single, coordinated organism, producing, moving, and consuming in harmony. For soldiers trained to believe in hardship as a virtue, this was an unsettling revelation. Productivity did not require cruelty, nor did abundance breed. Moral decay seemed to reinforce both ingenuity and order. Every new observation further eroded their ideological armor. Soldiers began comparing American precision to the chaos and shortages they had endured in Africa, Italy, and Eastern Europe. They calculated production rates, marveled at the speed of transport, and speculated about the underlying infrastructure supporting this society. Radka noted, even the smallest towns seemed to hum with power. How can a nation like this be defeated? And as the train chugged onward, the prisoners realized that the myths they had been taught, the inferiority of the enemy, the inevitability of German triumph, were unraveling thread by thread. As they approached Chicago, the prisoners were confronted with another revelation. The sheer scale of industrial output along the rail corridors. The Rubbertown synthetic rubber complex produced 800,000 tons. WWII. The Fort Willow Run B-24 bomber plant was churning out one bomber every 63 minutes. These figures were not abstractive, they were lived experiences, witnessed firsthand by soldiers whose previous understanding of logistics, production, and technology was rooted in Europe's constrained reality. Zimmerman shuddered, realizing that the war was no longer a contest of valor but of sheer industrial and social magnitude. And here, as they stared out over the endless factories and humming towns, the prisoners grasped a terrifying truth. The Reich's propaganda was powerless against the lived experience of abundance, efficiency, and modernity. Their world had been carefully constructed around illusions, and each new site in America dismantled these illusions with clinical precision. The soldiers could only watch, awestruck and fearful, as their assumptions about power, society, and technological capability crumbled before their eyes. At this point, I must remind you, if you're following this journey into history and wanting to support the exploration of these incredible stories, please click the subscribe button and like the video, as it helps more people see this content and ensures the truth of history reaches a wider audience. As night fell on their third day in the heart of America, the soldiers could not know that the next phase of their journey would confront them with the pinnacle of industrial might, assembly lines, production schedules, and technological precision so advanced that it would leave even the most experienced soldiers questioning the entire premise of German superiority. What awaited them in the factories of Detroit, Toledo, and Chicago was more than Maschinenszeit, was the revelation of a nation's heart, beating in steel, electricity, and relentless motion. The journey that had begun in the deserts of North Africa culminated in the heart of American industry. For the German prisoners, the rail lines that carried them across the United States were not merely transportations. They were corridors into a reality so astonishing that it threatened to shatter the remaining pillars of their ideology. Factories, plants, and assembly lines stretched as far as the eye could see, each a monument to efficiency, precision, and organizational genius. Every worker, every machine, every process was part of a vast, coordinated effort that dwarfed the Germans' expectations. At the Fort Willow Run B-24 bomber plant, The prisoners witnessed a marvel of modern production. Bomber fuselages rolled steadily along assembly lines, parts converging from all directions with clockwork precision. A single B-24 bomber was completed every 63 minutes, a speed and scale that no German industrial complex could approach. Radka, standing at the viewing gallery, felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. In my life, I have never seen anything move so fast, so perfect, so unstoppable. Around him, fellow prisoners muttered similar sentiments. They had trained to fight armies, not industrial systems, and suddenly the machinery of war revealed itself as the true battlefield. The prisoners also saw the rubber town synthetic rubber complex, producing 800,000 tons per year, feeding the needs of tanks, trucks, aircraft, and industrial equipment. At Alcoa's aluminum plant, 175,000 kilowatts of power transformed raw bauxite into essential aircraft components. Everywhere they looked, scale and efficiency combined to create a spectacle of human achievement. Zimmerman began calculating output in his notebook, trying desperately to reconcile these numbers with the Reich's claims of American inferiority. Every equation he scribbled only deepened his unease. The prisoners could not help but notice the human dimension of these operations. Workers moved with purpose, but without the despair or fatigue that had marked German laborers at home. Men and women worked in shifts, took pride in their output, and maintained a rhythm that was simultaneously relaxed and precise. The Germans began to see that productivity was not born from fear or cruelty, but from organization, innovation, and incentive. What they had assumed were weaknesses, freedom, comfort, and well-being were, in fact, sources of strength that fueled a nation's war machine. Letters and memoirs later recorded the psychological impact with startling clarity. Radka wrote, "We came to fight soldiers, but we found a civilization, a force of intellect, electricity, and motion. We were unarmed against it." Zimmerman reflected on nights spent in POW barracks, staring at the distant lights of factories and wondering how his homeland could compete with such a system. Each new factory visit, each new assembly line, forced them to confront the unvarnished truth. The Reich's military victories were fragile when contrasted with the industrial and technological reality of its enemy. As the train carried them from city to city, the prisoners observed interconnected supply chains that had no parallel in Europe. Raw materials flowed seamlessly into production. Components merged into final products, and these products were shipped to support fronts around the world. The scale was overwhelming, the pace relentless. It was not brute force alone that defined American superiority. It was the integration of society, industry, and technology into a coherent, unstoppable system. The prisoners realized that even the most disciplined German divisions could never match this synergy. By the sixth day of their journey, the psychological transformation was profound. What had begun as a military defeat and exposure to humane treatment had evolved into an unshakable understanding of industrial supremacy. Soldiers who had arrived in America expecting weakness and decadence were forced to confront a reality in which abundance, innovation, and coordination created a force far stronger than any individual army. Even hardened officers, like Zimmerman, could no longer reconcile their faith in Nazi propaganda with the evidence before them. Every factory, every conveyor belt, every humming machine became a silent indictment of the ideology they had once defended. The prisoners also began to grasp the social and technological implications of what they were seeing. Private ownership of automobiles, widespread electricity, modern hospitals, and consumer goods reflected not decadence, but capability. Education and training programs ensured that workers contributed effectively to the war effort while maintaining personal dignity. For soldiers conditioned to believe that hardship and suffering were necessary for strength, the realization was both humbling and terrifying. The Americans had created a society in which efficiency and humanity coexisted, producing results that Germany could not match. By the time the prisoners returned to their barracks after the factory tours, their notes and diaries were filled with reflections of awe, envy, and resignation. Radka summarized the transformation succinctly. "I have fought men, but here I have fought a civilization, and I have lost." Zimmerman wrote, "We have learned too much to return to ignorance. The Reich's lies have crumbled beneath the weight of what we have witnessed." The combination of military defeat and industrial revelation had irreversibly undermined the ideological assumptions of even the most devoted soldiers. The journey across the United States concluded not with combat, but with understanding. German soldiers returned to their camps with a new awareness. Their enemy was not merely a military adversary, but a technological and social colossus. They had observed systems of production, transportation, and societal organization that dwarfed the Reich's capabilities. And while the war would continue on distant battlefields, the seeds of ideological collapse had been sown. Nazi soldiers had learned, through lived experience, that Germany's claims of superiority were hollow in the face of human ingenuity, organizational discipline, and societal abundance. In the end, the crossing of the Atlantic, the train journeys, and the factory tours had accomplished what no battlefield defeat alone could achieve. They had exposed German soldiers to the truth. Victory could not rest on ideology or valor alone. It required the power of a society capable of sustaining unprecedented production and efficiency. And for Radka, Zimmerman, and thousands of others, the lesson was clear. The might of the United States was not a myth, it was a reality that even the most loyal Nazis could not ignore.